but you just need to know the general concept of cyclical unemployment. What does this mean? This is unemployment in the big picture that is due to natural swings in the business cycle. Natural swings in the business cycle. Now, what's the business cycle? The business cycle is, theoretically, the idea that over a period of time, a lot of people will say every 5 to 7 years, our economy, a lot of modernized, industrialized countries with similar kinds of economies are going to have periods of growth and periods of recession or shrinkage. Okay? You can't realistically expect to just have constant growth year after year after year after year. At some point, there's going to be too much capacity in the economy. There's going to be too many tech companies like there was right around the year 2000 and the bubble burst. Okay? There's going to be too much excess in the financial services industry. We just had that recently where times have gotten tough, and one of the things that have gotten tough is some of the banks that overextended themselves or really didn't deserve to be doing financial business, loans and so forth, have gone out of business. And so this is a way that some people argue, at least, the economy can kind of clean itself up, right? So we're going to have downturns and upswings, and that's what we call a business cycle, right? It's not an exact science, of course, just like a lot of things in this class. It's theory, it's opinion, it's based on evidence. For people to accept it, you have to have some examples, all right? But a lot of times people have said for decades, economists have said that you can expect a business cycle to go 5 to 7 years on average. Now, you have exceptions, certainly. The 1970s, early 1970s, clear exception. World War II, right around that period of time, Great Depression, an exception. Right now, an exception. We don't expect recessions, or at least the kinds of things that go along with recessions to last this long. So that's why it's an interesting time to be taking this class. We're living through the Great Recession. Although everybody says the recession's over, right? Recession is over technically if you use the measures that you're going to be taught today to say, whether or not a recession is in play. But we still have these measures that would get attached to a recession that are out of whack, like the unemployment rate, right? If you're not in a recession, you normally in our country don't expect to see a 9% unemployment rate. So let's go to chapter 6 now. Chapter 6. I actually want you to go to the end of chapter 6. For me, it's page 146, where they have a visual titled The Phases of the Business Cycle. What page is it for you guys? What is it? 150, Phases of the Business Cycle. You see that? There you go. Phases. Should have asked first. The phases of the business cycle. Okay? So you'll notice there, all right, that you've got a visual that shows what I'm talking about. Over time, right, the economy can expand. There'll be an upswing of growth. And according to your book, when it hits the high point, what do they call that point? The high point, the peak. Very good. This is one of the things that's on your review sheet here that you need to know. Okay? The peak is the high point. What would we call the low point? The trough. Think of a pig, reaching down in the trough. That's the low point. Now, we spend most of our lives not at one of the high points or the low points. So what do we call the period of expansion? Expansion, right? And we're going to say, well, how do we measure this in just a minute? What about the period that might be a recession? That's a contraction. And as we come out of one phase and into another, that transition, that early part, is referred to as a recovery, okay? Or, if we're on the downswing, contraction into a recession. Well, what is a recession? How do we define a recession? The very simple definition is what? That's right. Hopefully you guys saw this in your reading. 2 consecutive quarters, a quarter of a year. So that's 3 months is a quarter. 6 months continuously of what? A decline in real GDP. We know what real is now, right? Real is not nominal. Real accounts for inflation. Remember, there's a difference between real and nominal income, real and nominal interest rates. Same thing with GDP. If we just say, we produced this much stuff this year as a country, right, in year one, the audio is working, just took a while.
$10,000.
No, yeah, it must have started and I didn't see it. I didn't notice that on the timeline.
Okay. Year two, he made
One note.
Yeah, isn't it going to give me a preview?
Click it.
Okay.
Give it something relative.
All right, there we go. That works. Okay. So, he said 2 consecutive quarters of a decline in real GDP. So that brings us to the question, what the heck is GDP? Well, first of all, you need to know what GDP stands for. GDP stands for what, people? Gross Domestic Product. But what's the definition? The definition that I want you to write down right now, word for word, is this. GDP is the market value. The market value of all the final goods and services, of all the final goods and services produced in a country in a year. The final market value, did I say final again?
Just the market.
Sorry, the final market value of all the final goods and services produced in the country. Now, since I brought this up, we're going to go to Refonomics.com. We're going to use one of the resources that I alluded to. I think I mentioned last class that a recent AP exam had one small brief that just tested whether you knew this definition really well, in detail. And there's a nice little visual here that emphasizes each piece of that long definition. GDP and what's not included. It's kind of like an old school visual. But there it is. The market value of all the final goods and services produced inside a country in a year. In a country in a year. And as Mr. Reff says, there are many important words. So let's take a word or phrase one at a time. Market value. What does market value mean? Does it mean let's count up all the stuff that our country produces in a year? The number of items, like the number of rim customization orders, or the number of t-shirts, or the number of smoothies, the number of model trains that got sold? No, that's not enough. We need to know the market value of those. Paul can tell you, internationally, the value of some item that he sells changes from year to year, correct? Based on supply and demand. So what's market value in this case? Let's say a country X produces 1,000 goods and 400 services. The total number is 1,400, but that's not market value. It has to be the total dollar value, which takes into account the number times the price. We want to know what the worth is. The worth. Question or stretch?
I'm sorry,
Okay. So what about the market value of GDP for the United States at the end of 2006? Over $13 trillion. Not 13 trillion items. Take all the items that were sold or that were produced. That's really important. The difference between being produced and being sold. Final. What does final mean? Final means final. So let's say you've got cars for sale. Okay? And I just bought a new car a month and a half ago. There are items on those cars, like wheels, lights, license plate frames, those kinds of things, that could be sold directly to consumers separately, right? Or they can be standard, they can come with the purchase of the overall vehicle. That's two different ways, bless you, that these goods can be consumed. Whatever the final version is what's going to be counted so that we don't double count. So like it says, the tire is produced in a country in 2006, and it's placed on a car, a new car in 2007. The tire is not counted as a final good in 2006. The car, though, is a final good that is counted in the year 2007. So we don't count the tire that got sold to Ford so that they could put it on their car when they bought it, because it's still not in the hands of the end consumer. All right? We don't count that tire twice. That would be misleading. We're going to count it once it's available on the finished product. Now, if the company that produces the tires sells some to Ford, but they also sell some to you and me in a tire store, well, in that case, those tires in the tire store are in their final version. Okay? So those are going to be counted when they're produced for sale directly to consumers. Yeah.
How do you know who the final consumer is? Can I resell my car on the
You could, but we don't count. We don't count that in GDP. So we look at companies' financials. We say, all right, so who sold whom to what? And there are certain things that aren't counted, and that's coming up in this description. All right, so if a tire is produced in a country in 2006, it's going to be sold at a tire company. All right, in 2007, the tire is considered to be a final good in 2006 when it was produced, which is another key term. We don't look at when it's sold, we look at when it's produced. So let's take a look at that. Think of factories, which is where a lot of production happens. Okay? Does not mean sold. Once it's done being created, done being produced, even if it's sold a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, we count the year that it was produced. Inside a country means just that. Okay? Stuff that's produced inside of a country's boundaries. That's the whole thing, that's the whole notion of gross domestic. Domestic means at home. You domesticate an animal, it means I made it suitable to live in my home. It's domesticated, right? I was just over my in-laws a couple nights ago. One of them was talking about at work, somebody that they know has a wolf as a pet. Wolf. I guess in some states, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that in some states it's okay. You can breed wolves, and then you can buy them for domestication. You can use them just like a little dog. And I think you're asking for trouble, because I've seen a lot of episodes of Dog Whisperer. I saw one. People had two wolves that grew up and passed them. They were able to get them to behave because the dog was murdered fails. But that would be an example of domestication, right? Where you say, okay, well, it was wild. Now we're going to make it suitable to living at home. Domestic meaning at home. So that's the whole point. So if it's not counting American-produced stuff and services that are produced in other countries, then what would include that? Not gross domestic product, but gross national product. You need to know the definition. Or at least what GNP stands for. GNP is gross national product. That's right. In other places besides your home country. All right, but we're still with GDP, so that's inside a country. For example, if McDonald's produces a hamburger in China, McDonald's, an American company, produces, not sells yet, although they might produce it and sell it within 15 minutes of each other, right? Hopefully. Hopefully it's not like produce it one day and sell it a week later. But we count when it's produced. If it's produced in China, the hamburger is considered to be part of China's GDP, even though it's an American company that produced it there, not the U.S.'s GDP. And then in a year just means that. In a year, although a lot of times we take a look at GDP on a monthly or quarterly basis, as well as an annual basis. Yes?
Let's say we produce it here, but we ship it to China. That counts as GDP.